be okay. Right. So where to start? Because this is such a vast topic, isn't it, team leadership? It really is one which we could talk about for months, I think would be fair. As always, when it comes to where do we start, I like to start with the guru, which is Meredith Belbin. Meredith Belbin is 95 and he's a wonderful person to be working with. And I'm going to start with him and his book, Team Roles at Work, which was first published in 1993. And I'm going to chapter 11 and very much looking at leadership in the modern world. It's just almost 30 years old, but it is still incredibly relevant. And what Meredith's talking about in this is the difference between the solo leader and the team leader. So the solo leader perhaps is that leader who's more visible, historically the one that you see, takes on any role, assumes any responsibility. The solo leader sort of has free rule and free range, and rules absolutely. No barriers, just does what needs to be done without any delays, just gets it done, sorted. But what we're looking at really now is less that historical sort of solo leader, and we're looking more at that team leader, because sometimes things are so complicated that one person can't know it all. One person can't take all of that responsibility. So we're looking at something which is slightly different. The team leader, who very much sort of deliberately limits their responsibility and declines to say that I'm the absolute ruler here. What I'd love to do right now is to actually just share a slide with you. So I'm just going to share screen. And here we go. This is a really useful, it's actually taken straight from Team Roles at Work. It's taken from there. So when we're talking about the team leader, and please do join in, Deborah, Chris, Patrick, the team leader very much chooses to limit their role. They like to delegate work to others. They know that they can't do it all, isn't it? They know and they understand that actually they don't have all of the answers. Whereas that solo leader kind of just interferes in everything, wouldn't you say? So, yeah, absolutely. So then the team leader also is building on diversity. They know, because they don't have the answers, they need to be able to build that team around them.
And I think so often, because we're talking about really good team leaders here, and so often what you find, I'm sure you find the same, is that what people have done is brought in people who are similar to them. And yes, that is not an effective team leader. In a way, a little scared if someone might show me up. You know, they seem brighter than me, they seem more able to do something. And we talk about the really excellent team leader, I'm sure we get onto this in more detail later, that is looking for that real mix of different types of people. Absolutely. And they seek this talent, don't they? They're not threatened by others. If you're having somebody in a team leadership role, they're not threatened. I quite like this, actually. This is taken directly from Team Roles at Work. It says the team leader does not expect to be wiser, more creative, or more far-seeing than colleagues, and in consequence is humbler than the solo leader. For that very reason, the team leader seeks talent in order to compensate for any personal shortcomings and to improve the balance of the team. The team leader is less interested, and often not interested at all, in admirers and sycophants. It's that humility, isn't it? It's the understanding that one person cannot do it all. And so they need to develop the team, don't they? They need to develop the team. They're not looking at you do this. What this team leadership is there to do is to give responsibility to others, to not interfere and have that trust that everybody is doing what needs to be done. But to do that, what the team leader really needs to do is be able to create that sense of a mission. What is this team here to do? And by creating a real clarity of mission means that you can have that element of trust and knowing that everybody is doing what needs to be done without directing work all of the time. It's difficult though, isn't it? It's difficult because this all starts, I think, with a real sense, if you're going to have strong team leadership skills and to be a strong team leader,
you've really got to know yourself well, haven't you? You've got to know yourself incredibly well to be able to do that. Isn't that your experience, Deborah? Let me just stop sharing the screen here.
Actually, before we do, just looking at the screen still, I just
let me do that.
It doesn't matter. I think people will remember.
That's fine.
I just wanted to point out that, of course, in this session, we're focusing on team leaders, but to say that we're not saying solo leadership always bad.
No, not at all.
It's about saying there's a time and a place. The majority of times, and certainly I'm guessing for the majority of work that most people here would be doing, we are looking at that team leadership. But it's also, there are times in particular crises or whatever, where having everyone involved and discussing is not appropriate. So I just wanted to say that before going on.
No, I think that's a really good point, isn't it? And I think just recently, over all of the challenges and everything we've had as organisations over the last 18 months whilst going through the COVID crisis, I know there's been times when actually we've needed a solo leadership. We've needed somebody just to step up and say, this is what we're doing, because that speed was needed. Not all of the time. I think there's fits and starts, isn't it? Sometimes you need the solo leader, then other times the team leadership comes to the fore. But it still starts with self, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. I mean, I certainly, it's stating the obvious, but that really deep degree of self-awareness is absolutely vital. And I'm just thinking, with the leadership programs that I've worked on over many years, the question I'm asked more or less every single time is, which team roles make the best leader? Well, there's not an absolute answer to that. It really depends on, within that individual, what mix of team roles they have. But it's also, yes, that degree of self-awareness of, these are some strengths that I have and these are some weaknesses or some gaps. And I saw someone's chat, saying about the humility. Yes, it is that. Of course, it's the not trying to think I can be all things to all people. But I really think we get channeled down in the wrong way if we say that all leaders need to be, and something that comes up quite often is like shaper with coordinator. Well, yes, in some organizations and some setups, that's fine. Other times, the legitimacy that person might have is perhaps because of monitor evaluator being strong in them, that strategic approach, and yet they're not likely to be as inspirational, but it's that understanding that they're not. So making sure someone with them is working with them, next to them, who's like that. Other organizations I've worked with, I mean sort of tech areas particularly, then very often it's someone who's got plants within them. That doesn't mean a plant's a great leader, but if that individual has the strong creativity, that's appropriate for the culture of the organization, I would say. So there's a little phrase, a little quote, forgive me for the wrong pronunciation probably of the person's name, but from the 5th century BC that we're talking about, but Lao Cha in China. But this phrase I thought was lovely, or this quote: a leader is best when people barely know they exist. When their work is done, the aim fulfilled, the people will say, we did it ourselves. And yeah, I just thought that so much summed up, whether it's the humility, the understanding, what you were just looking at, effective teams, having a mix of people around them.
Perfect. Thank you. It's this, and I'm going to steal a phrase completely, and I think Patrick knows which phrase I'm stealing and I'm about to say, is that, especially when it comes to team roles, it's not about the cards that you've been dealt. It's not those, it's how you play them that is really critical, isn't it? So it doesn't matter about your team role strengths, your team role weaknesses, it's how you play those through the lens of leadership to ensure that you're using them in the right way. Wouldn't you say, Patrick? I think this is really important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it starts again with self-awareness, because in order to do that, you have to know what hands you've got in the deck.
Yes.
And be able to go, coming back to something we were talking about earlier, about what the way to lead when things are changing a great deal. Something we all went through last year, going through again with hybrid working and people working out how to get back safely to the workplace. Knowing what's in the hand and then going, okay, so here are the strengths I can lean in on myself, and here are the strengths I can lean in with the team. And this is a time when I need to be more the sole leader, or this is the time when I need to be more the team leader. And having the awareness to be able to do that becomes super important.
And that links into that sort of situational leadership as well, doesn't it? You're not just being one leader all of the time, regardless of everything else which is around you. You are responsive to the environment and playing, like you said, whichever cards you have, you're making sure that they are relevant and needed at that particular time. Absolutely, absolutely. But how do we know what cards we have? I think that's one thing. How do we know they're the right cards? Because the cards we think we may have, we may think we've got a really strong suit or run or whatever. I haven't played poker for years, my goodness. A flush, a royal flush, I'm trying to think now. But we may think we've got a fantastic deck, but actually they're not as good as we think they are. Because I think the other key thing within leadership, isn't it, is to have the humility to ask other people for their feedback to where they think our strengths are. To get feedback. I know Harvard Business Review have written a wonderful article about this, about how important it is for that authentic leader is to ask other people for feedback about how they are leading, what behaviours they're showing, and what is being valued by others.
Yeah, there's a fantastic tool of getting feedback from others. It's just so useful, isn't it? Knowing these are the places where I'm playing strongly.
Yeah.
And this matches what I already knew about myself. Yeah, that's coherent. And this is kind of the stuff that I didn't know. Well, there's some useful insight. And that you mentioned the Harvard Business Review. Just yesterday, I was reading an article in McKinsey Quarterly about the whole the whole business of how to manage what they call the Great Resignation. Yeah, lots of people
leaving.
Do I want to go back to doing what I was doing the way I was doing it before? And actually, one of the really one of the most interesting things it said leaders need to do is they need to reappraise both their own skills, but also they need to go out and ask the people that are working in their organizations what it is those people need from them. And I thought that's interesting. The power of that, of feedback, the power of asking rather than just assuming we know. Yeah, often we've got this kind of weird idea of leadership about being somehow all-knowing and all-seeing.
Absolutely.
And stuff's changing the way it's been changing. That just doesn't work.
It doesn't, does it? It really doesn't. I think you're right there. I'll get the link off you later for that that particular article. It sounds fascinating. Just had been really conscious that we have 17% of people, I think it was, who don't really know much about Belbin. So just as a recap, to find out your Belbin team role strengths, you complete an online questionnaire called the Self-Perception Inventory. And this tells you how you feel, which these 9 clusters of critical behavior, which ones you have strengths in, which ones you're okay with, and which ones, you really should delegate. But that just starts with the self. What's so important, we have a different questionnaires. You then ask for feedback from other people and they complete what's called the observer assessment. It's just a list of words and people tick which words are relevant to you. And there's some which are relating to the strengths of each team role and some which are relating to the weaknesses for each team role, because we know that these team roles have strengths and allowable weaknesses. So then once you get feedback from at least 4 people, you get a report that gives you this information that we've been talking about. It gives you this information about how you see yourself, your own behaviours, but also which ones that others see and value, and the ones, like you said, Patrick, other ones, the skills and behaviours that people want you to use, and which perhaps they may want to see more of. Chris, sorry, Deborah.
Sorry, Chris, just to say that the key thing there, of course, is lots of different people will see you very differently. So the really good thing is these observer assessments, as we call them, you get this input, and it might be that what a particular leader is wanting is to get input from the people who are, say, reporting directly to them. At another time, they might want to get input from whether it's, the board of trustees or whatever, but it's different people will see you differently. And even if you have good enough, close enough relationships, it's useful to get input externally from clients. What are they seeing in you? And that way the individual can see, okay, as a leader of these particular people, this is how they're seeing me. This is what they see as my strengths, weaknesses. How do I feel about that? What am I going to do about that? But also, how am I seen by others? And I think that's the real beauty, that it's not that we are just then statically this person because a few other people have thought of us like this, but there's that, we're different people in different contexts and relationships, and we can use the input from people on these reports to gauge that.
Perfect.
I'd like to stick with the diversity theme. And we are all very different people. And this is something that I think the Belbin Team Roles helps us celebrate, that we are who we are. And that's not to be changed. And whatever the mix of a team is, that is the mix of the team. But I think from a leadership point of view, the worst thing you can do with Belbin Team Roles is for the leader to keep those to themselves and to use it as a measure of the people in the team.
Yeah.
The strength in using Belbin Team Roles is that everybody knows the strengths and weaknesses of every other person in that team. So it's not what might be called a management cosh, where you think you can control your team because you know how they may behave in certain circumstances. This information is to be shared, and also the team should understand the strengths and weaknesses of their leader. And I think that's when this is how you can start and use Belbin Team Roles to the most effective.
Yeah, it's no good having it and just keeping it to yourself and using them for whatever reason you are. This is something which should be open, it should be shared. And how do you know the strengths and weaknesses in your team? That and unless you ask them to share their Belbin reports. Before we go any further in this, I'd just like to, there's a couple of questions come up, which I'd just like to answer live. So a great question here. So what we're talking about is that difference again between that team leadership and that solo leadership. Would it be correct to say that for routine functional delivery, solo leadership is more effective, whilst for that more cross-functional or project assignments, team leadership is ideal? That's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, we've talked a bit about situational, haven't we? That it depends on the situation, but what does everybody think here?
Well, okay, I certainly would not say that. I mean, I don't think that one can generalize as much as that. So yes, there will, as you were saying earlier, Joe, there will be times, when just in that crisis point or something that you want to go solo. But the majority of times, I think, and I saw someone's chat very briefly, but I think that in some ways solo leadership is illusory, because it's really not often the case. We have a figurehead sometimes, or someone who will appear to be that solo leader, but in fact, unless you have a complete dictatorship, most of the time the solo leadership is really about saying someone is taking more the figurehead, but unless they're getting some input from others, I think it's just going to be a very ineffective setup, very ineffective organization. But I think what I was saying at the very beginning, when I just wanted to flag that up, was that sometimes with the team leadership and the aspects we were talking about is having that common goal, that common mission and discussion, and just occasionally there's not time for all of that. But I think if there's a strong enough team and an understanding, then very often the people working for that leader can trust them enough to know that if a decision is made, then it's going to encompass what other people think. I don't know, Chris and Patrick, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I'm back to what you said, Deborah, about the illusory nature of sole leadership. think about the number of times when things are completely static. You're not looking for any improvement. Things are going exactly to plan. How many leaders, how many managers do you know who are in that situation where you go, I've got a plan, it's all working, I just need to see it through and push it through? It doesn't happen very much. And as soon as things are a little bit uncertain or a little bit not on plan, and then for any of us to try to sort that out on our own, rather than to bring others into the loop, and have, back to the humility point, have the humility to accept that we probably haven't got all the answers, but they're there to be found, starts to become important. So unless things are completely static, predictable and perfect, and for how long is that ever the case, we have to be leaning in on the resources, the wisdom of those around us, I think.
So what we're saying here is that team leadership, Chris, is needed more?
Yes, I think the notion of it's where you started, Joe, that this notion of the heroic leader and good teamwork just don't go together. And leadership, I like to think of this in two ways: as leadership of teams, but leadership in teams. And where does leadership in teams come from? And with a good team, where there is trust, where there is good leadership from the nominated team leader who knows that they can safely step back and trust in the members, then the actual the leadership of any particular project or on any particular day could sit with any individual in that team, depending on the expertise that was needed at that time.
So what you're saying there, Chris, is do you always need to have that one team leader, or can that leadership be shared? Or do you in fact need leadership if you have a team which is incredibly effective? Is there a time where perhaps you don't need it?
I've seen it working with no nominated leader. I've seen teams decide not to have a nominated single leader, and it can work. The difficulty comes is if the team becomes stagnant, where does the restart come from? And sometimes you do need that one person there. So I guess it depends very much on the maturity of the team. And good teamwork is very, very difficult to achieve. It doesn't just happen. You've got to work at it, and you've got to have a good common understanding and good levels of trust for this to happen. So I think there are many different versions of team that you can have. But it's down to the understanding of its component parts. That's where the effectiveness comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're saying that actually it depends on the team. You can't just make any assumptions there. You really have to look at each team independently. And again, it goes back to that everybody needs, and it's critical at that point to make sure everybody understands the strengths and weaknesses within the team for that to happen as well. It's part and parcel.
I was interested, Chris, in that, exactly that. But with the teams where it has worked, that they've agreed to not have a single leader, maybe either had a number of leaders or whatever. How has that meant that you have been with them, helping them to get to that as an external person, or have they just done that themselves internally? I'm interested in.
Right. Okay. So within the majority of the work I do, my role is as a team coach. Therefore, I am very definitely not there to lead that team. And again, in the context that I do this work with a lot of the younger people, they are experimenting with lots of things, most of them legal, but they're experimenting with the idea of working together. They're experimenting with being a leader. And in some cases, they don't want to. Nobody wants to stand up and be that leader. It's not my role to replace that function, but it's to get them to question what it is they really need and where is the direction coming from.
We've got in the chat here actually. We've got somebody saying that, hi, Stephen, actually just saying they're developing a self-organization. As a team coach, it's taught me so much. You don't need a nominated leader, but you do need very clear lines of accountability and to develop a real maturity and shared self-awareness and emotional intelligence in teams for it to work. And I think that's what you were saying, isn't it? It really depends on the team understanding the role of leadership, understanding when it's required and understanding who and when is needed. There's so much there, isn't there? Thank you for showing that, Stephen. Thank you. Okay. So looking at the differences between solo leadership and team leadership, sometimes, not always required one or the other. Looking at the case of self-awareness, about starting with the leader understanding their strengths and their weaknesses, and really to try and get feedback from other people to ensure that it's just not their ideas of what their strengths and weaknesses are. It's really looking outside, and it could be within the team that they are leading, or like Deborah said, it could be outside the team as well. And then the idea that team leadership could be shared depending on the team, what it's there to do, and ensuring that there are clear lines of control, etc., communication, that actually you could have shared leadership, or if you could possibly ever get away with not having a leader because the team was working so effectively together, which I suppose is all of our ideals. That would be amazing, but teamwork's quite difficult, isn't it? Let's not pretend that that's an easy job. I'd love just to go back a second and look about, once we've got the feedback from other people, what do we do with that feedback once we've got it? So once you've got your Belbin individual report, once you understand your strengths and how other people, do you find in your experiences, everybody, do you find that there is a level of coherence matters in how effective a leader you can be? That, what am I trying to say is, if there is a difference between how you see yourself and how other people see you, does that matter in a leadership role?
Rather than jump in, I thought
no, come on, you're not being far too polite. Can I just say that normally nobody can be shut up here. This is just like, what's going on?
Right, so the question was, does it matter? Yes, I think it does matter.
Yeah, it's important to have a coherent profile, to be the same to others as you feel you are to yourself.
I think it's about awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And with any sort of leadership, whether it's direct leadership of others, even if it's the heroic leadership, you could be stepping in to really kickstart a group of people, or taking control of a chaotic situation. If you can't lead yourself first, you're never going to be able to lead anybody else. So and we've touched on this a few times, this whole idea of self-awareness. And if you are aware how you are likely to behave in certain situations, then I think you can, when needed, moderate that. I noticed there was I got distracted before because I was following the comments.
Don't do that. No, don't.
No, but I noticed that, and I'm just going back to it. Right, so from Steve Hill, Steve said, isn't a solo leader a shaper? And yeah, maybe not. I think that a shaper, just to talk about a specific role, could be the person, it's the person there cracking the whip. It could be that person. But there would be a time for that profile, for the shaper profile, just to take a back seat. If a person with a shaper profile is aware of that, and they know that they're the one who's likely to always step in and take that lead role, they can empower other people by simply not doing that. So I think this level, one of the things that Belbin Team Roles does, it gives you this level of self-awareness, or it can help you to develop this level of self-awareness with regards to your potential behavior, where you can either think, well, I've really got to push myself here because I'm not really all that comfortable with this, or I really need to tone this down because it's not going to be useful in this situation.
Perfect. And to have that, yeah, Deborah.
On that point, not the just this is shaper, because no, as you say, it maybe may not, but I think there's a mistake when people just think, oh yes, it's a shaper. But going to that broader point of coming back to we've been talking about with the self-awareness, and someone asking about the coherence, really. So in terms of having your Belbin profile there, with having self-perception and then the observer, how do these particular other people see me? I actually don't think that it's always a problem if there is a difference there. I think it's about if there is a difference, but the person understands why that is, and they're still being authentic enough. It's not that what they're they're pretending they're something else, but it might be that actually they do really think that at heart, they are someone who's really motivated by in-depth study and, excuse me, and so on. But actually, that's not needed in the leadership role they have at the moment, and they are able to show themselves in a different light. And as long as what the other people are seeing is those other behaviors in a positive way, then it's fine. I mean, what the reports help to do with that, knowledge of self, is if they're seeing a lot of the downside of a particular set of behaviors, then it's development. So it's, that's it in adding to my knowledge of myself. But I don't think it always therefore needs to be exactly the way I see myself is the way others see me. I think it's that choosing which part of myself I need to use effectively, not just putting on a mask, but actually really inhabiting that approach.
See, we're all nodding here. I think the key thing is asking the question in the first place. It's knowing, isn't it? It's knowing, getting the feedback from other people, and that is the first step to then what happens next, or what the questions are, or the development that you actually have. But how do you know any of this unless you don't ask for that feedback from your observers? We've got a good question here that I'd like to ask, and I think this may lead into some work that you do, Patrick. I know we spoke about a previous webinar. It's from Patricia. There's still many organisations where senior management is made up of solo leaders who only work collaboratively with the other few in their circle of trust. In such organisations, those who try to be the leaders rather than bosses encounter numerous barriers when trying to do right by their teams, because those above them simply don't even try and consider certain leadership behaviours as weakness. Do you have any advice on how to deal with this? So you've got the senior management is made up of solo leaders who only work with their collective view. In such organisations, those who try to be leaders rather than bosses encounter so many barriers when they're trying to do the right thing with their team, because, others don't even try and consider that those behaviours. Let's talk about leadership teams. Go, Patrick. This is quite an interesting question, isn't it? It's a really good one.
There's such a lot in here, because there's some of this is about kind of how cultures emerge, I think, with different styles of leadership, and what it's important enough to the organisations, or the organisations can do to shift those cultures along. And actually, a number of things that we've already been talking about are hugely important to getting this right.
Yeah.
To be able to raise it in the first place, if the system allows that to be possible, and to be able to bring to awareness how things are operating and what the consequences of how things are operating, is a bit of this. Leaders being able to have the courage to say, in order for me to lead the way I need to lead, I need these things both above and sometimes from below me.
Yes.
And I'm going to give an example of the below me, because it is something we talked about before, Joe, which is one of the phenomena. This isn't always about what comes from above. Sometimes it is, and that's particularly hard to crack, because you have to have at least some will from above, some motivation, I think, from above to do something about it. And often that's when something goes sufficiently wrong enough for those above to go, actually, yeah, we probably need to do something here. One of the other things we find is interesting, because sometimes find a situation where in leadership teams, something slightly different happens, which is that it's the people below turn up in the team and kind of lose their will to lead. And I'll give a real example, and this is not unique. I've seen this come up with multiple teams, and I think it comes up for a variety of reasons. Is you imagine a team where you have a nominal leader, and actually the leader might be quite willing to be inclusive with the team, for people within the team to lead, but for some reason what the people in that team keep doing is deferring to them, expecting them. And coming back to what you said earlier about team roles at work, and I noted it down, was making the assumption that leaders somehow going to be wiser and is going to have all the answers and be better informed. Wouldn't that be lovely if that was the case? But I think most people in leadership are often somewhat less well informed than the people who are further down in the organisation, who are close to what's really going on. In those assumptions, if those assumptions start to creep into teams, then what can happen is a pattern of leaders forgetting how to lead, turning up. It's the leadership team where the leaders sort of the only one saying stuff because everybody else is either nodding and go, oh yes, that's very wise, or they go, well, I don't, what do you think? You've got to tell us, and almost expecting the sole leader rather than the team leader.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of things seem to be at play when this happens. One of the things that sometimes contributes to this is leaders who are very associated with their own teams under them, but don't necessarily bring that same leadership in when they're working with the other leaders that they have to collaborate with.
I think you do see this sometimes, don't you, where you have this most inspirational leader with their team, it leads incredibly effectively, then suddenly they're in with other leaders and suddenly they're just not as bright, their light isn't as bright anymore. They seem to have lost that ability.
Yeah, and what you need to do in that situation, and this might be a mixture of raising awareness. So actually the Belbin reports are a fabulous way of raising awareness of this is what's going on, a bit of observing the team, a bit of individual coaching, a bit of working with the team as a whole, is start to encourage the other members of the team, because it's hard work for the leader of that team. They're having to carry everybody out of the role of leadership for the whole team, is to start to encourage the other members of the team to lean in a bit more, get over whatever it is that's blocking them, whether it's a limiting assumption, or I've always done this way, or this is just what I expect of people who lead teams because that's how we've always done it in the organization. And then give the titular leader of the team, the nominal leader of the team, the freedom to be able to lean out a bit more. And it's the point that Chris was making earlier then, which is that that allows the people in the team to take their share of the leadership more freely.
Yeah.
And see this happening at all levels, but particularly actually the more senior groups of leaders get, the more these sorts of patterns seem to creep in.
Yeah, sorry, I want to interrupt.
Go on,
I just was going to say, I so much agree. It just made me think of a situation where it was just a few years ago now, but where I was working with a team and they had a relatively new chief executive, and I'd had individual sessions with each of these really senior people who were part of the team, and they were complaining about him. They were saying he's really not a good leader. And it was because he wasn't telling them what to do. I mean, they were being paid an awful lot of money, but the culture, and I saw someone talking on chat and culture, very much so. What they'd had previously was the leadership of the organization. The chief executive had been someone who was very directive. They were used to being told. So in a way, they weren't empowered. They were okay once they were with their people, but on that leadership team, they just weren't. I'm complaining about this guy who is saying, but I thought they would want that. I want them to take this responsibility for the thousands of people each had working for them. So it just made me think of, as you say, the importance of trying to get a team like that to understand what the dynamics are.
Exactly. And actually, if you can change that within one senior team, then it starts to creep into and shift the bigger culture. So then you're chipping away at that other problem of, the stuff, those assumptions that come from the top down, because it will work. It's going to work because the leaders are leading. You've got more of the resources available to the decision making, to the work that that team's there to do, and that is going to come out in lots of ways in performance. And as soon as you see enhanced performance, people take notice.
Yeah, and you'd expect me to say this, but with the particular team I was talking about, what helped, it wasn't all made perfect, but what helped was then that understanding of why, and the team roles, the fact that this new person had a high monitor, evaluator and coordinator. So that was really helpful. And then by using team roles as that discussion, that's why, of course, I've worked for Belbin for years. I'm going to say this, but I just so passionately believe that the number of times I've seen how useful it is for people to start being able to say things which perhaps wouldn't have been acceptable to say in another way, but being able to use the language of the terminology of the team roles allows the conversation to take place.
Yeah, and I love that, because then it almost gives them permission to play to their strengths, doesn't it?
So, sorry, Chris, I've realised.
Oh, no, just say Chris had to go. I was trying to get him involved in that bit, but he's actually just got all of his students at the moment just about to start a webinar looking at creativity in leadership. And it's a shame we can't all jump onto that one, actually. But there we go. It's going to be an assessed workshop, so it's quite important. So I'll say thanks to Chris later. I love this conversation, and it all comes down to awareness, doesn't it? It all comes down to communication and to be able to talk, and using that language of Belbin to be able to talk about which cards you're playing, which cards you've got, and how you need to play them within that leadership team, doesn't it? I also love the concept of this leaning in, leaning out. I think this is one that's come to the fore, hasn't it, very much over the last couple of years, especially with Brené Brown. But it's that whole idea of really being able to, it's giving yourself permission, isn't it? It's having that permission to be able to do that and to contribute. My goodness, we've covered already such a wide range. I have to apologize, I've got so distracted by the chat. There's some wonderful, wonderful things going on in there at the moment. So I'm going to make sure that we take a copy of that. So just to summarize really where we started, we looked at the difference between team leadership and solo leadership. And for those of you who don't have team roles at work, don't worry. Vicky has written an amazing article, which I'll put in the comments in a sec, which really does summarize those differences and the importance of that team leadership, having that humility to understand that actually you can't do it all. The team leader who understands their own strengths and weaknesses and understands that they need to be able to put that team together that complements that. So that's also very important, why a team is put together carefully and with care. And if you can't do that, at least have Belbin as that language to be able to talk about the strengths and weaknesses. We talked about perhaps that role of leadership could be shared. We talked about the sharing of leadership and whether or not you actually need a leader in the first place. And then we've talked about the idea of the team leader then becoming in a leadership team, of what happens. And again, that dynamic changes. It changes due to many different reasons. Also, the effect that culture has on the entire conversations that we've been having. Is there anything that you'd like to bring in here, either Deborah or Patrick, anything that you think is really interesting in this conversation about that team leadership? What top tips would you give people who are perhaps in a team leadership role?
I should let Patrick speak first because I keep jumping in.
Well, I'm dying to hear what you have to say as well, Deborah. So let me just give you I'll try to be brief, a quick version, a quick thought around, and it relates, I think, to one of the questions about that came up in chat about what do we do when things are valued or undervalued. Getting curious about what the strengths of the people who work with us in the teams we're in and how that matches with our strengths. Sometimes those are going to rub up against us the wrong way. Sometimes those are going to feel like a delightful combination. But just starting to get curious about that, and I think the Belbin reports are just a fabulous way of getting the data to start having those conversations, is to me a really good start point. Because as soon as we sort of drop our filters of what should be, what shouldn't be, and instead go, I wonder what's actually going on here and how we can do with it and work from the data, we're always in a place where we're going to get to some insight, which is in turn going to drive some better decisions. So that would be a big thing for me.
I love that. Challenge the assumptions and things that we think we know, when in fact we don't. Start from a point of data, get from a point of understanding. I love that. Thank you. Deborah.
Yeah, well, I guess what I wanted to say was that sometimes we can talk about things in a general way. Of course, a conversation like this can only be general, but I think the most important thing, it sounds the most obvious, but is to look at what's the point, what's the purpose, what's the raison d'etre, and that's going to be different, of course. I mean, perhaps you've got the overall organization, but then the different purposes of the team or the work, so people can talk about what makes a high performing team, what's a good leader, and we can talk about these things. Of course, we need to know them and understand them, but it then comes down to what specifically is going to be needed within this team, because we might say, well, we need a really well balanced team with a mix of very different types of people, and yes, that has been shown. I mean, on the original research, it showed that to have a team that had different behaviors that you could call upon, yes, that's going to be the most useful. But that's not the case all the time. And, sometimes I'm going back to thinking about sort of R&D areas of in the high-tech organizations. And it was stuffed full of certain types of people who were, let's say, sort of plants and whatever. Whereas in most teams, you don't want to have lots of those. But in particular teams there, you do. So it's for the leader to really think about, what is it that I need? We've already said this, and what do other people need? And then that trust. It is really about you can't just have it. And someone said earlier that ego gets in the way. Yes, of course it does. But we've got to look at that deep level of trust, and it's how can that happen? And I think it just does come down to communication, and to there being trust. I like the way Patrick was talking earlier, and with Chris saying, the leaning in, leaning out, and then the, up or down. But unless there is that trust internally, as it were, then you haven't got one another's backs necessarily. And I think that a really good team leader has the backs of their people, but actually the people want to have the back of that leader as well. So, don't know, being a top tip. Yeah. They're my thoughts.
Well, it's not just about the team leader, it's about everybody within the team. Yeah. And I think everybody should be looking out for one another. I think it's what you're saying. Yeah. It's an interesting one here. It's not really a question, but it's come up on the Q&A, and I do love it from Sid here. History is full of achievements of solo leaders, but not enough success stories about team leaders. And in a way, that's almost a deterrent for the promotion of team leadership. And in fact, going back to originally what you were saying, Deborah, which Meredith says, is that the team leader isn't one who's going to necessarily be that visible. Because if you're being, if you are being, with the lack of ego, with humility, and ensuring that it's a team success, not necessarily an individual successes, it is more difficult, isn't it, sometimes to see and have the visibility of a real strong team leader. Maybe we have a responsibility for finding stories and examples of strong team leadership and start talking about them.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I suspect the teams in which we find that team leadership, it will be as much about the team as about the leader.
Yeah.
Of course, the two go together, and that it will be the stories about the teams rather than, as Chris was saying earlier, about this kind of false idea of the heroic leader who's we identify with the solo leader. So finding those great team stories and telling those, I think, would be a great thing to do more of.
Absolutely. If the narrative is there, if the stories are there, people can relate to them and understand it and want to emulate that. But if they're not there, then we're always looking, aren't we, at this historic solo leadership role. Wow, we've covered quite a lot. It's 3 minutes towards the end of our webinar. We've still got lots of questions that are in, and we've got so much communication in the chat. What I'm not going to do, however, is my normal trick of trying to talk really quickly within those last 3 minutes and try and cover everything that everybody has asked and try and have an answer to everybody. So if it's okay, I'm going to take a copy of the chat. I'm going to take a copy of the Q&A. And for those questions that come up, I will ensure that we do answer you. Team leadership. I think what we need to say here is we make a commitment to, when we all see wonderful examples of team leadership, that we take note and we share them. And I think this will really help raise the awareness. And as we talk about awareness, of course, when it comes to team leadership, none of this is possible with that self-awareness, the understanding and the awareness of yourself, the strengths and weaknesses that you have, and the ones that are seen by other people, how to use yourself to start with, but then how to share that information with the rest of the team, for the team to share their strengths and weaknesses as well, and to be able to be a successful team as you possibly can be. It always starts with self.